I don't see why Africa would fall into the lower end, or would stay rather in the lower end of the value chain. We could be rivaling, our Asian counterparts.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Africa Asia webinar for tonight. And the discussion series that we've been having is on global value chains and Africa. And tonight we are having the last discussion, which is thoughts or considerations for Africa on global value chains. And basically, what we're trying to do is following up on the discussion from the last 2 weeks. We are looking at some of the considerations that someone within Africa, whether it's the policymakers or business people, should take into account, or things that they should possibly look into if they want to participate more in the global value chain. So tonight, with Ayanda, who has been gracious enough to join us in the last 2 weeks. And tonight we also have Maureen. And I will let Ayanda say hi and introduce herself, and then Maureen introduces herself, and then we will go into the discussion. Ayanda?
Thank you so much, Christine, and good evening, everybody. It's good to be back. Welcome to any new listeners that we may have, and for the ones that have been with us since week one, this is going to be a very interesting discussion. And yeah, I hope you have enjoyed the webinars thus far.
Okay, thanks, Ayanda. Maureen, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Christine, for the opportunity. My name is Maureen Wangi. I'm joining this discussion for the first time today, and I'm looking forward to having fruitful discussions with Ayanda, Christine, and with eventually when it's shared with the listeners. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Maureen. And so I think to just give a recap from the last weeks. So the discussions that we've been having have been mainly around the global value chains. What are global value chains? And we explain that by saying it's like the cross networking of the production processes, the marketing processes of goods and services through the globe. So what it is that trade has become such an intertwined affair across many countries, so that not one single country is doing everything. So there's someone who is producing, another person is giving capital, another person is marketing, and then there's someone who is trying to, come up with innovations in tech and in the knowledge economy to feed into the entire global value chain. So we've also looked at how Africa is doing, and in the last week, we highlighted some of the things, considerations on Africa and its place in the global value chains. And what we noted mainly was that being like a producer or a participant in the global value chain at the beginning of the chain, where a majority of what Africa does is contribute raw materials or contribute low skilled labor, then the return on that is most instances very low. This is considering that someone else is offering maybe tech, or they are offering maybe marketing or something higher up the chain, and they tend to be able to get a better return. So we looked also at how, because of the global value chains, there have been changes in business transactions. So, for instance, the development of or the rising or strengthening of multinational enterprises, which is these companies that will be across many different countries, and then also that they are almost a mini kingdom in themselves, in the sense that there are many sides of transactions that they're dealing with. So examples of like Google, example of Amazon, such entities where you find that someone is offering cloud computing, they're offering the search engine, they're offering so many things, streaming services, and all these things. So at the end of the day, they end up tapping into very different things within like the global value chains. And then also at the same time now, looking at maybe the goods side, there's someone who is producing goods, but then they're also using their own technology, or like have developed themselves in such a way that they're able to do a lot within the global value chains. And then we considered how when such entities come, like within Africa, then how would African businesses be able to compete with such multinational enterprises? But then this is also considering that Africa need not invent the wheel, in the sense that you need not start doing everything. You just need to look for the thing that you could be good at as Africa and plug in into that in the chain and do a good job at it. So that's just a recap of what we've discussed so far. And at this point, I will invite Ayanda to start off the discussion for tonight on some considerations, like that Africa should look into as we carry on this discussion about global value chains. Ayanda?
Thank you so much, Christine. And I completely agree. When it comes to global value chains, there really is no need to reinvent the wheel, because a lot of the times these value chains already have within them systems and procedures that are followed by all the players in the chain. And what governments are required to do is to find where they best fit within that trade linkage. But one of the major disadvantages that can be noted when it comes to Africa's participation within the global value chain is the costs that are actually incurred by these governments, because at the end of the day, it's not just about what you are able to produce. You need to think not just about the production, but you're thinking about the cost of like transporting those goods from whether it's the factory onto a train, the factory onto a plane, or if you're lucky enough to be on the coast, coastal charges and the infrastructure that actually is required to ensure that these trade routes are actually 100% exploited by African governments. And one way in which that can be done is through upgrading the way in which African countries and African governments participate within the global value chain. This is something that would require a lot of focus on improving productivity to ensure that when there is some form of active participation or active integration within the global value chains, we are able to, as a continent, reap as many of the rewards as we possibly can. So, one of the ways in which Africa can better participate in global value chains is through economic upgrading. So, this is to try to change the structure of how we do things within our economy by trying to ensure that when we do produce goods to go into the global value chain, we are focusing more on the higher end of the spectrum. So, this would require a lot of research and development to go through, and a lot of knowledge transfers and product differentiation. So there is, for example, a firm in Ghana known as Blue Skies that is majoring in this economic upgrading. It adds domestic value to the fruit industry by cutting the fruit locally and then shipping it to the European supermarkets by air, instead of actually exporting the fruit in its whole self. And then a second way that we can do this upgrading is through what is known as social upgrading. So this is more focused on the employment side rather. So trying to find ways of increasing employment conditions, because as we noted earlier, there is a gap when it comes to employment conditions. Yes, within Africa, that allows there to be a lower cost when you're participating within the value chain. However, what we are not trying to do, because Africa is a labor intensive is labor intensive as compared to the rest of the world, but by improving employment conditions, we are then also able to improve the output. So many African countries, they need to try and find a way to balance these two, and to find a way to improve specialization, improve the way in which we are participating within the value chain whilst looking at the products that we are producing. As we noted, I think it was in week 1 or week 2, that Africa produces a lot of your raw materials. So, like with the Ghanaian example, if we're producing fruit, how can we add value to that fruit? We had provided the example of copper. instead of exporting raw copper, rather we make the copper wires or whatever else is needed later on in the value chain. And I know it's easier said than done, but if we're able to really harness this, I believe that Africa would be able to make huge strides when it comes to participation in global value chains as well as economic growth and economic integration. Christine?
Okay. Thanks, Ayanda, for those comments. And yes, I do agree that there's quite a bit of scaling up that's required by different African countries. Maureen, if you could possibly give your comments or any thoughts that you have on the topic, then I will pick it up further from what Ayanda has explained.
Okay, thank you, Christine. So for me, I'd like to shift the discussion slightly to taxation. And in taxation, in relation to global value chains, I looked at it in two different ways. So the first is that, of course, for Africa to be part of global value chains, it would mostly be through multinational companies. And for those multinational enterprises to invest in African countries, there has to be a conducive environment for investment. So, which means there could be some fiscal incentives that we're giving these companies, could consider giving them tax breaks or any other incentives that they would need in order to invest in African countries. So, in a sense, there's need for African countries to look at their tax policies, see which policies could be stifling development or just generally preventing large-scale investment into countries. And I know there's different ways to do this. So a number of countries usually have bilateral investment treaties with other countries in which they have preferential tax agreements with those countries. It's also possible for countries to just have, for example, export processing zones, special economic zones in which they provide fiscal incentives for multinational companies and generally any other companies that can help Africa to contribute to global value chains. So generally, African countries should look into their tax systems and identify what tax barriers exist that would prevent Africa from contributing in global value chains, and see or rather research into potential ways in which they could remedy those areas, research also into incentives that they could offer to these multinational companies. But the other side of the discussion on tax, what I thought of was that in giving multinational companies incentives, generally also multinational enterprises are known, they're very notorious for tax planning, aggressive tax planning, and tax avoidance. So at the same time, as we're giving them incentives, as we're giving them incentives so they can invest into our countries and so that we can participate in the global value chain, we also need to make sure that they are paying their fair share of tax. And there are a number of initiatives around going on around the world currently in relation to tax. One of them that I've been reading about is the global minimum tax, which is sort of a push for countries to decide on a minimum tax across the world. And it is thought as one of the ways in which multinational companies, which typically avoid tax, could be subject to tax, because if it's going to be applied all over the world, then wherever they set up their operations, then they will be subject to tax. So generally, the current push for global minimum tax is being pursued mostly by G20 countries and the countries that are mostly the countries that participate under the OECD. So African countries' participation in that debate has not been as great. So that's potentially one area in which African countries could consider looking into, so that they make sure that even as we invite multinational companies to invest in our economy so that we can join the global value chain, we also have to make sure that those companies are paying their fair share of tax. Yes, those companies will have contributed by giving jobs, and jobs currently are a big issue in many African countries. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that they pay their fair share of tax. This is especially so because a lot of the companies in African countries are small and medium enterprises. small and medium enterprises will not have access to aggressive tax planning and avoidance methods that MNEs may have. So it's very likely that if we encourage MNEs and not put in place measures to make sure that MNEs are also paying their fair share of tax, then the tax burden will fall disproportionately on the SMEs. So I think those taxes are very, very key, a very key consideration for countries in relation to um, joining the Africa participating in the global value chain. Christine, I don't know if you have any insights, especially because you're in the tax field.
Okay. Yes, this is a topic I'm passionate about, and especially when you consider like the digital economy. So let's now to give like an example, picking it up from what Maureen said, is Google has been able to advertise, let's say for instance, in Uganda, and has been able to target people in Uganda and for advertising and earn income, and this income, Uganda is not able to tax it. And why is Uganda not able to tax it? First of all, because Google has no physical presence in Uganda, and most times you need like a nexus or a point of contact between like Google and Uganda and a territory for you to be able to like tax, lay a claim to those business profits. And in the traditional tax rules, that was mainly through like a physical presence. You need to have like a physical presence. Now, what has happened in most of the digital economy is that you don't need a physical presence to even sell goods into a country. Look at Amazon, for instance. Amazon are set up is able to supply and meet orders in many African countries. I don't have the exact number, but they are able, you can order from Amazon and receive the goods. And now what that means is that Amazon is able to sell into Kenya. They will not pay VAT, for instance, and they will not pay tax on their corporate income that they're earning. Someone selling the same goods in Kenya who is like a local company, which has a brick and mortar shop where you go and buy, for instance, a book or buy clothes, then they are very easy to be targeted for tax compliance because you see, for instance, you need a license and someone will ask you for your tax compliance, and then that way you're able to be tracked that you're not complying. So all this to say, especially within the digital economy, what's happening is that the local businesses are suffering a very high amount of tax compared to digital businesses. And that's a thing that will always put the domestic companies at a greater disadvantage unless someone is able to tap into this digital economy and tax them fairly so that they're able to pay their fair proportion of taxes. And as Maureen have noted, there's a lot of ongoing discussion on taxing the digital economy, and I think also the Africa Administrative Forum is trying to do a good job in helping African countries to come up with ways that cater to African needs. Because, and I'll say this in all like consideration of what OECD is doing, like the output that OECD is giving is not pro-African countries. It's not pro source countries where this most of the times it's like, for instance, Kenya will be importing most of these digital solutions, and so most of the times Kenya will be paying to like US companies for these things. So when you look at the proposals that the OECD is giving, you realize that Kenya is not benefiting. Most source countries are not benefiting, and Kenya, for instance, refused to sign on to the OECD final agreed solution for taxing the digital economy. As I could go on this topic, but yeah, that especially the digital economy, if there has to be a proper participation and proper competition, then African countries need to have their own solutions, which I don't think the OECD will offer them. And then also, anyone listening to this, you can consider what the Africa Tax Administrative Forum is giving as alternatives and what they have really considered to be alternatives to OECD for African countries, which is a consideration on really what are the needs of African countries. And then also, I think connected to that, another consideration for like African businesses and African policymakers is that there's a lot of loss of monies from Africa through things like money laundering, through things like illicit flow of funds, which also again, what happens is that there's a lot of money that's being stored offshore, and or it's just being siphoned to offshore places where that is benefiting other countries, or in terms of like what even the banks can invest and do with it, and that those funds are coming from Africa. And if you can look at like the latest Pandora Papers, the leak, you see that some of the people who have been mentioned there relate to like funds that have left Africa. And one of the things that really happens in such a case is that there's loss of money from African countries which could be used for development, which could be used for advancement. And then what happens is that sometimes, if we are lucky, that money comes back as foreign aid. So it is round shipping of money. So you find that someone has been given mining rights to a mine that's located in an African country. That money they pack it offshore so that they pay the company within Africa such a low amount of money for very little thing, because they say it's only that the minerals that they're selling and there's no value addition to the minerals. But all the money that comes from the sale in the international market doesn't come back to the African country. So then now what happens is that there's a lot of money which is not coming back even for the very little that we are selling. And then at the end of the day, someone gives it as foreign aid with conditions and sanctions if you don't comply. So these are things that policymakers would need for you to participate in the global value chains. First, the systems have to be considered to address things like money laundering, base erosion, and profit shifting from Africa, taxation in different aspects of it. Because without those, then there are such loopholes, and they are very huge loopholes that someone is just using to exploit what could have been used to develop. I could go and on, but if you could give your additional comments on the topic.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I'm glad that you mentioned the taxation perspective, Maureen, because it's one of the things that we noted that is a barrier to trade within Africa. And as the both of you were speaking, I was just wondering, when it comes to taxation, and either one of you can respond to this, when it comes to taxation of trade, is it more expensive, or is the tax burden heavier when the taxation is intra Africa trade as opposed to trade with other continents?
Maureen, do you want to take it, or should I give an attempt?
I think you should, because you're the practitioner.
Oh well, okay. So I think I under to answer that. You see, within like let's say within like the SADC and like the East African community. So there's there are customs unions. Like so there's a common external tariff like within EAC. So if you're within the East African community, we apply a common external tariff. What that means is that any goods coming from Kenya to Uganda are treated as if you're in one market. But anything coming from outside the EAC countries, we apply one common tariff to them. So, if, for instance, it's machinery, farming machinery, then the rate that would be applicable in Kenya would be the same as the rate applicable in Uganda. So now, what happens is that you first of all you reduce the competition between the countries, especially when you're porting the goods, because if you are applying the same common external tariff. Of course, there are some modifications depending on what a country needs. So if the country feels like it needs to grow its agricultural sector, they may be allowed for a certain period of time to apply a different rate. But then now what happens is that now you see EAC has that, SADC has that, and now you see like a country like Tanzania is in EAC and it's in SADC. Then you see that COMESA also has its own arrangement of how like the importation would work. So, but then I would say like what happens within most African countries on the tax side is that you find like within EAC, you wouldn't say that if it's because it's treated as the same market, then there wouldn't be. You wouldn't say that Uganda is disadvantaged to be trading with Kenya, at least not from a tax perspective. And I think what will even make it much, much better is if the Africa Continental Free Trade Area advances to the point where we have like a common external tariff, where we are customs union, because we will trade as if we are one market. And,
I'm so happy you went to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, Christine, because that was the main reason I was asking. On the basis that um looking just at trade and listening to the insights that you and Maureen gave, it begs the question of Africa's ability to fully exploit global value chains. Because going back to what I said earlier about the issues that exist within the African trading system, when we're talking about things like our transit networks, we're talking about things, as you've been saying, money laundering, corruption, employment, and all of these various factors that when you look at them in isolation, they seem small, but adding them together, it does create a very big block. And one of the issues that arises when it comes especially to social upgrading is that research and development factor. It is about knowledge sharing and a willingness and an ability for Africans to share knowledge, for African countries to work with one another to fully exploit the global value chains. And I'm hopeful that the African Free Trade Area will actually allow us to do this. And as you've said, we have all of these customs unions already in place. And with these customs unions, it would work best if each customs union was to see how they could best exploit um, their goods. So, looking at our oil rich countries on the west coast of Africa, how they could work together to increase value, such as moving from crude oil to creating your petrols and your diesels, to not only export outside of Africa, but to also find a way to reintegrate it into the African trading system, to allow, for example, I don't know, maybe the manufacturing industry, because they use a lot of machinery, to upskill or to upgrade how we are actually able to effectively use our manufacturing industry. If we're talking about car manufacturers in Morocco and South Africa, we get that fuel from is it Chad, if I'm not mistaken? I could be wrong when it comes to oil and Algeria. And then they channel that to your Moroccos and your South Africas. They improve manufacturing. If we're looking at manufacturing of textiles, then we're actually able to um, increase the value that we're adding into the chain and lower the costs, because even within our continent, we are upskilling ourselves just by creating an ecosystem almost in the way that we trade. And I think one of the major issues that is there, and one of the major burdens that exist within intra Africa trade, is the tax burden. It is the difficulty when it comes to transport systems. So, if we're able to actually fully tackle and address some of these things, I don't see why Africa would fall into the lower end, or would stay rather in the lower end of the value chain. We could be rivaling, our Asian counterparts, and we could actually manage to develop in a way that would not only benefit the country as a whole, but would even benefit the poorest in society, which I would believe is one of the major objectives of trade, is one of the major objectives rather of any government policy. Yeah, I could go on and on about the benefits of trade within Africa. And Maureen, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to share.
Yeah. So on the discussion on the continental free trade area, so obviously it's a very good opportunity for Africa to be able to sort of harmonize the rules and regulations in certain areas, but also there's the concern that it's supposed to be built upon the regional economic communities, which are termed as the building blocks. But those regional economic communities, most of them also have their own rules, regulations, and some of them even have much deeper integration than what is currently under the AFCFTA. So I think that's also a potential concern for policymakers in making sure that Africa participates in the global value chains. Because if AFCFTA is to be built upon those regional economic communities, many of which have their own rules, some of them deeper integration, how are those rules and regulations going to be harmonized so as to make maybe to just streamline trade within Africa? And I know that the agreement actually says the agreement establishing the AFCFTA actually says that where there's a dispute between, not a dispute, but a conflict between a regional agreement and the AFCFTA, then the AFCFTA is going to prevail. However, it does say that those economic communities which have deeper integration will be allowed to continue with their deeper integration. So I think that's a potential conflict, and that could possibly hinder the working of the AFCFTA if it's not something that policymakers have considered and tried to prevent the problems that could come from that. I think that's something that I thought about regarding the AFCFTA.
Okay, and I think also to add on to that is there's need for also African countries to take seriously what the after the agreement states. So, for instance, if we are already there and you're required not to go and negotiate for bilateral agreement as if you're not in this economic unit, then you shouldn't do that. Like how, and we've had discussions of that kind in the past here, where like Kenya is pursuing to have a free trade area with the US, and a different Ghana is trying to do its own thing. And then, first of all, you're within EAC or you're within ECOWAS, you're within COMESA, and then first you go act and disregard everything that's in those agreements and go act as if you can solely negotiate for your own terms of trade with an external party. That's problematic, especially where we now should be integrating towards like acting as a single market and considering what it is that would benefit other countries. Yet you enter into agreements as if you are not part of that. So I think that's another concern that African countries don't quite seem to take seriously those agreements, especially if you are to consider like the EU versus what is the result of what has been happening since the launch of the ACFTA. It's quite worlds apart. And then also in addition to that, I also wanted to add to the discussion on what Ayanda you had said, that how nice it would be, especially like if you consider South Africa has a very good car assembly and it exports cars. Why can those cars be exported within Africa? Why would it be that African countries are still importing second-hand cars from Japan, from Germany, from the UK, from these other places, instead of buying from someone who is producing them not very far away? But then one of the quick answers to that, first of all, is the cost of transport, maybe from South Africa to Nigeria. It might even be cheaper to import from China or from Japan or from elsewhere. But you see, so there is production that's happening that could be of value within Africa, but there's not much trade because there even other cheaper options that someone is looking at because of these other non-tariff barriers. So as much as within like the EAC, there is no tariff, we are acting as if not acting. We are in the same customs union and we are not charging tariffs, customs duty to each other. There are also non-tariff barriers. Also, when you look at someone who wants to go offer their services, like in South Africa from an African country, before you get that visa, you might just as well apply to go to the US, or going to coming to maybe open a business in like Kenya. What are the requirements that you'd have? And when you consider like what are your requirements for work permit vis-a-vis someone who is not from an African country, although Kenya is different because especially for Africans, it's comparatively easier. But when you look at these other non-tariff barriers among African countries, I think that really, really affects how much trade can happen because of the cost of doing businesses, because of these other rules that you have to comply with. So those are the additional comments that I wanted to make in that. Maureen, you could give your closing remarks as we wind down, and then Ayanda, you can give your concluding remarks.
So again, thank you, Christine, for the opportunity and for the very fruitful discussions we've had. So generally for me, I think in determining, or rather in making sure that Africa becomes part of the global value chain, it's very important that Africa participates on the discussions ongoing around taxes, but especially because, as you've pointed out, those discussions that are being led by the OECD are not very favorable for African countries. So I believe that African countries need to contribute their voice to that debate so that we can have a more conclusive and a more inclusive um, more inclusive discussions on tax, and discussions that will also affect how African countries design their tax policies to make sure that they join the global value chain. Then the other thing that we've mentioned is the AFCFTA. I believe it's a very good opportunity for the African continent, and since trading has begun under the AFCFTA this year, I believe that it's very crucial for policymakers in Africa to see how the AFCFTA can be used to make sure that Africa joins the global, continues to join global value chain. And in that sense, they also need to look at some of the pitfalls that could come up, especially in regards to the regional economic communities and the multiple and overlapping memberships of those communities. Yeah, but all in all, thank you for the opportunity and for the discussions.
Okay, thanks, Maureen. It was nice to have you as well. Ayanda?
Thank you so much, Christine. I will never underestimate the power of trade and the power of trade to lift societies and communities out of very dark places. I know that global value chains are difficult to integrate into. However, I do believe that if there is an increased focus by governments to try and upskill their nationals, to try and actually dig down and focus on ensuring that whatever their core competencies are, they're able to fully exploit them, and for there to be enhanced intra-Africa trade to try to improve our specialization, to push the continent as a whole towards the later stages of the value chains. It's something that I know will not be done in a day. I don't think it will be done in this decade. However, I do hope, and I hold on to the hope that Africa will one day be a major player within global value chains, and not just as a lower end player, but on the higher side of the global value chain. And I know that with the introduction of the Africa Free Trade Area, there's still a lot of unknowns that are at play, especially considering, as Maureen and yourself, Christine, have noted, that even within the regional blocks, there's so much that needs to be done by the countries within those blocks. There's certain agreements that they follow and others that they don't. So it would be very interesting to see what the effect of the Africa Free Trade Area will be on Africa as a whole, as well as Africa's participation, not only in terms of intra-Africa trade, but global trade, and whether we will actually be able to harness all of the benefits or most of the benefits that come with being a major player within global trade. And with that, all I can really say is that time will tell, and we will definitely be watching it with a keen eye. Christine?
Okay, thanks, Ayanda, for those comments. And I think from my side, what I would say is that the world has changed, that we are trading globally, so that if as a country you have weak systems, whether it's the judicial system, whether it's your policies, then that affects your position in how you can participate in global trade. So as I think Ayanda you mentioned last time, is there's need to strengthen institutions within African countries. And this goes back to like whether it's the constitution and the rights to protect property in there, or to like giving judiciary freedom to be able to make decisions that can determine commercial outcomes favorably for businesses, or the ability to negotiate commercial contracts and to be able to enforce them in those countries without interference by the executive. These things, they're not just even rights of the people within that country. Those are the core things that will make you succeed or fail in the global economy. That's the first thing I wanted to say. And then secondly, also, the knowledge economy is the driver of the creation of wealth today. You see, in the past, when Adam Smith was writing about the wealth of the nations, then it was the factors of production, which were land, which were labor, which was capital. Right now, it's almost like labor becomes like written code for the digital economy, where don't need to come and install software in someone's laptop. You actually just need to give them a code that they can use to download it. So you find things like labor are increasingly the economy, the whole economy has become digitalized, and this requires the knowledge economy and the digital economy, and the tech to be what drives integration into the global value chain. So African countries really need to look at that not as an option but as a need, because in the coming days, when you think about it, in the early 2000s, which is not too long ago, is that it was just the beginning of when the digital revolution was happening, when people were starting to like create email accounts, and know like how you can have your website for just a few businesses. Right now, almost every business now has to go online, especially the COVID pandemic, where people now moved even to online shopping. The need for the digit development and integration to the digital economy becomes more and more, and it will only become more and more with the fourth industrial revolution. So for African countries, these are key things that needs to be considered. And it has been a good discussion. I hope our listeners have learned something from it, and it has profited you in whether it's in research, whether it's in policy making, whether it's in your business. And we'd like to hear what your comments are. You can leave that on our social media pages. For tonight, thank you so much, Maureen, for joining us, and Ayanda. And it's goodbye for now.
I don't see why Africa would fall into the lower end, or would stay rather in the lower end of the value chain. We could be rivaling, our Asian counterparts